Our next speaker is Harriet de Wit. She will be speaking on the ecstasy in the laboratory, recent advances in MDMA research. Harriet de Wit, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago, where she has studied the behavioral, cognitive, and subjective effects of alcohol, psychoactive drugs in human volunteers for over 30 years. Her NIDA funded laboratory-based studies investigate the effects of single doses of drugs, including both legal substances such as nicotine and caffeine, as well as illegal drugs such as MDMA. Please welcome Harriet.
Pointer? Yeah, and just stay behind. Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed the presentations until now. My presentation follows very closely on what you just heard from Kim Kuipers. We do very closely related research, so you will recognize some of what I do. So I will be talking about some of the studies that we've been doing over about the past 5 or so years with MDMA in healthy volunteers. Oh, I can see it here. So our kind of overall question is whether MDMA actually has unique empathogenic effects. So there are clinical reports, so ecstasy users in particular report that the drug makes them feel strongly connected with other people. And similarly, in the treatment of PTSD, I don't need to tell this audience, MDMA has demonstrated clinical efficacy. Interestingly, in a lot of our studies, we look to animal studies as parallels and as animal models of the effects of the drugs that we're looking at. And with most of the measures that we're interested in with MDMA, it's difficult to come up with sensitive animal models. But there is a report from some researchers in Australia that actually MDMA produces something called adjacent lying, which is a unique behavior that you don't see with other psychoactive drugs. And it's suggestive of affiliative behavior. So they've studied this behavior and they've ruled out many other possible explanations like thermoregulation or changes in sensory perception. And they're making a big jump there to suggest that this might actually be affiliative behavior as we see in humans. So just, we've already heard by the definition of ecstasy, of course, or Molly is the product that's available on the street, often not pure, but that's what people are usually aiming to get, the pure MDMA. It's a ring substitute amphetamine derivative. It's sometimes referred to by other names, and there are other chemical variants. It's a mechanism of action you just heard in the previous talk. It increases norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. So in many respects, MDMA is like a prototypic stimulant drug and produces stimulant-like effects. It increases release, blocks reuptake, and inhibits the metabolism of the neurotransmitter in the synapse. And for those of you that are interested in the chemistry, there are other presentations that go into more detail. There's a lot of interest in exactly which receptors the MDMA works on to produce these interesting effects. It's also interesting from a basic science point of view because the drug, because of its unique action, might tell us something about brain function and which transmitters are involved in what kinds of brain function. Interestingly, as you also heard, MDMA is a potent releaser of oxytocin, a neuropeptide that's involved in bonding. And there are a number of studies now that have shown increases in blood levels, plasma levels of oxytocin after MDMA. And this might contribute to some of the effects that we see, the behavioral effects. So MDMA can affect behavior in a number of different ways. It's our job as scientists to figure out what exactly it's doing. So we're trying to take apart those clinical reports that people say they feel more connected with other people. So what does that actually mean? So we can measure how the drug makes people feel, their mood states and their feelings. We can look at whether they perceive emotional stimuli differently, positive emotional stimuli, negative ones, social ones, non-social ones. We can look at their social interactions and their desire to socialize. So the drug might not change their perception of stimuli, but it might simply make them feel more social, and that's a question that we could ask. It might act specifically on memories, or in particular emotional memories, and one set of investigators in Europe have been looking at MDMA as a moderator of sexual response as well, although we have not done that work. Just to, if you're interested in the topic more broadly, there are two excellent reviews recently, especially the first one there, summarizing the state of science with MDMA until now, and I'll be referring to some of these studies. So just to give you a context of the studies that we do, the studies are all double-blind and placebo-controlled. So as in the previous speaker, we always give our subjects placebo on one occasion and then drug on other occasions. They're double-blind in a special way. We don't tell them what type of drug they're going to receive. They might get a stimulant, a tranquilizer, a sedative, or a placebo. So we try and equalize their expectations. So we don't say you're just going to get amphetamine or you're just going to get placebo or MDMA. The doses vary across studies. We recruit healthy men and women aged 18 to 35. They're carefully screened to exclude anyone with psychiatric diagnosis or substance dependence. They have to have a minimum of high school. They have to have some prior use of ecstasy, but we set a limit, so we're interested in early use rather than very extensive use. And we control the menstrual cycle because we know that stimulant drugs produce different effects at different phases of the cycle in women. And we often include a comparison drug, often but not always. This is just a summary of the protocol. Typically, our sessions are about 4 hours in length. We do pre-testing to make sure people have not used other drugs and the women are not pregnant. Then they take a capsule. We wait a while until the drug is absorbed, and then we administer questionnaires or physiological measures at regular intervals over about the 4 hours. And we time our behavioral tasks so they're around the peak of the effects of the drug. So here are some of the measures that I'll be talking about. We look at the mood-altering effects. How does the drug make you feel? We look at perceptual effects. So how does the drug affect perception of stimuli? We look at social behavior. We look at reactivity to stress, memory, and sexual interest. Here's an example of a self-rated mood scale. We simply ask on a 100-millimeter line, how sociable do you feel right now? Or how anxious do you feel? Or how high? And see people just basically mark on a simple 100-millimeter line how they're feeling. So this is the question, how sociable do you feel? And here are some results from this. Now, in this study, we actually had a comparison drug of 20 milligrams of methamphetamine administered orally. I should say all our drugs are administered orally. And we see here the two what we have here on the axes is the time after administration. So the first time point is before the drug was given, and then we have regular time points. We ask the people to fill out questionnaires at regular time points after taking the capsule. And here are the ratings of how sociable do you feel. And the two lines at the bottom, the blue and the green ones, correspond to placebo and the low dose of MDMA, and then the two lines at the top correspond to the higher dose of MDMA, that's 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, and the 20 milligrams of methamphetamine. And you can see that those two are very similar. We do dose our MDMA for each individual subject based on their body weight. So I will be talking about doses in terms of milligrams per kilogram. So here you can see that there are commonalities between a prototypic stimulant drug like methamphetamine and MDMA. Here's another visual analog scale. So this one of these lines where they make a mark. And you can see that there's a little bit of a differentiation here on ratings. The doses of the drug that produced equal increases in sociable, now we're seeing a little bit of an increase in on the MDMA session and ratings of how loving they feel, and similarly a little bit higher ratings of how playful they are feeling. So we're seeing a little bit of a differentiation here between the prototypic stimulant, methamphetamine, and MDMA. So I won't go, I do have a lot of slides with data, and I'll protect you from showing all the data from all these. I'll just summarize here some of the previous studies that have been done with social perception. It's been shown that MDMA increases ratings of attractiveness and of trustworthiness of other people, and it increases other people's ratings of how other people are regarding them. So they feel that people are seeing them more positively, and they also rate social images more positively. It also increases physiological responses to happy expressions. So we measure smile muscles and frown muscles, and when we show them pictures of happy faces, their response is to smile more. Basically, it's a physiological and objective indicator of emotional response. And it decreases responses to threatening faces. And this last response here, this last measure, is of particular interest because we and others have shown that MDMA, one of the most reliable effects of MDMA is to decrease reactivity to negative expressions in other people. And so you can see this fits with the appeal of the drug in a social situation where there might be a little bit of tension. And if they perceive less judgment or less negative expression in other people, it might make them a little bit more open to be social. And similarly, in the context of a therapeutic situation, if they perceive their therapist as being less judgmental, and if the drug dampens this sense of being judged, it might make them more able to talk about difficult issues. So this is one of the findings that's been most consistent, this decrease in reactivity to negative faces. We have also used the task that you just heard about from Kim, the cyberball task. It's a measure of social rejection. It's basically a virtual ball tossing game that's used to measure ostracism. Basically, in our version, there are two ball players, and the little hand at the bottom is the subject, him or herself. And there are two phases to the game. There's an acceptance phase for about 2 minutes where the ball gets tossed to the subject, him or herself. And then there's a rejection phase where the other two players throw the ball back and forth to each other, but the subject himself or herself is excluded. And surprisingly, since it's just cartoon figures, this actually induces a strong feeling of rejection in subjects. And we were interested in whether MDMA would reduce this feeling of rejection. So we had 36 subjects. They played those two games, an acceptance and then a rejection, and then they rated their mood. And indeed, we found that MDMA reduced the negative mood effects of rejection. Over here on the left side of the panel, you see 3 bars with accept, ACC, underneath. And that's their ratings of positivity of mood during or just after the acceptance phase. And the first bar is placebo, the second bar is a low dose of MDMA, and the third bar is a higher dose of MDMA. So it didn't affect their ratings of positivity in the acceptance phase. But if you look to the next threesome, you see that first of all, and the blue line shows that they do feel rejected. They feel less positive after they've been rejected, but MDMA seems to relieve this effect. So it alleviates this feeling of being socially rejected. MDMA also, from several studies, has been shown to increase the desire to socialize. It increases the self-report of feeling social. It increases a choice of a social or a solitary activity if you give them a choice, and it increases the time spent socializing when people are tested in pairs. We have also used a kind of an unusual task to measure generosity. This is a welfare trade-off task where subjects answer a number of questions. Would you rather have some money, keep some money for yourself, or give the money to someone else? And the someone else can be either a friend or a stranger. And we wanted to know whether MDMA would make people more generous. And indeed it did. Here you have on the left their generous, how much they would be willing to give to a friend. The open bar is the placebo session, and then you have 2 doses of the 0.75 and 1.5 milligrams of MDMA, and you can see that it did increase their generosity to a friend, and there was just a marginal effect there with strangers. So there seemed to be a bias toward being more generous toward your friend, and this is consistent with some work with oxytocin, which suggests that oxytocin makes you more bonded with your in-group and actually less bonded with people that are outside that in-group. So that's interesting and consistent with the oxytocin literature. Interestingly, as I mentioned, the Lecti group in Europe has been looking at responses to sexual stimuli. So this whole profile of MDMA effects might remind you of an increase in sexual desire or sexual interest, and so that might be the sort of psychological construct. But it turns out that MDMA has very little effect on ratings of erotic stimuli. So they looked at either mildly erotic or more explicit erotic images after MDMA or methylphenidate. And these investigators actually found that the methylphenidate, so a prototypic stimulant, did increase. This is the last threesome of bars there. The first one is, this is a ratings of explicit sexual images. After placebo is the leftmost bar, and then methylphenidate is the middle bar, and there was an increase. And the last one is MDMA, and there was not an increase. So it's also interesting for us to find out what MDMA doesn't do. We're hearing a lot about what it does do, and it's also to get a good profile of what it's doing. We're also interested in what it doesn't do. There's also some interesting work with autobiographical memories. This group have reported that MDMA increased ratings of positivity and vividness of positive memories, and increased also brain activity in certain sensory regions when people were remembering these. And they found that negative memories were rated as less negative. Now, I just want to go through some, I'm going to run out of time, and I'd like to just show you some data that haven't been published yet. 5 minutes, okay. One is because there seemed to be a reduction in social anxiety, we decided to look at the effects of MDMA as well as amphetamine in a separate study on a stressful and on anxiety-producing real situation, live situation in a sense, and it's a public speaking task. So like I'm doing right now, when we do this in the lab, we have subjects give a prepared speech in front of some examiners and who don't smile at all, who take notes, and the subject also has to be viewing a videotape of him or herself while they're doing the task. It reliably increases cortisol levels, heart rate, and blood pressure, and also increases ratings of anxiety. So our question is, if MDMA really decreases kind of social anxiety, it should decrease this sort of evaluative stress. Well, as it turned out that we looked at we actually, in this study, we used a low dose of MDMA because we were a little bit worried about the combination of this very stressful situation together with a dose of MDMA. So we erred on the side of low dose, and we gave 0.5 milligrams per kilogram. And from these, just to kind of summarize what we found, neither MDMA nor amphetamine reduced responses to the public speaking stress on measures of cortisol, anxiety, or cardiovascular effects. And if anything, both of the drugs produced a little bit of an increase in anxiety. So this tells us something. It suggests that the MDMA would not be a suitable a target drug or pharmacological intervention to deal with real-life anxiety situations. Rather, it might be working more on perceptions or on memories or on more subtle kind of mood-related negative affect. But based on these results, we would not recommend it for people to be treating themselves with a drug like this on a chronic basis to deal with real-life stressors. This is going to be difficult for you to see, but it's basically their subjects' ratings of anxiety after placebo is the left panel, low dose of MDMA and higher dose of MDMA on the right. And basically, without having to look at the graphs themselves, we saw no effect of MDMA and subjective stress. Another interesting line of work that we haven't quite finished yet, it's in progress. We're interested in whether there's a lot of talk about from MDMA users that it makes people more sensitive to soft touch, for example. And there is a paradigm where people rate a very standardized rate of touching on your forearm, and it can be compared to touching on your palm, which is not so pleasant, and they can vary the rate of touching. The 3 centimeters per second is called a slow brush, and it's perceived as more pleasant than the 30 centimeters per second. And so we looked again at MDMA users, and we gave them placebo 0.75 and 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. And here we did see something interesting. So on the left is the 3 centimeters per second, and that's the soft touch that's read as a kind of a social stimulus. And the one on the bars on the right are the less pleasant one that goes a little bit faster. The first bar is the placebo. This is ratings of pleasurableness of this social touch. And this is the black bar there, corresponds to placebo, and then you have 0.75, 1.5, and then 20 milligrams. Again, we have a comparison drug of methamphetamine in this study. And although this study is still ongoing, so we didn't do the statistical tests, it does look as though the MDMA is increasing the ratings of pleasurableness of this task, of this touch. We also have been looking at whether MDMA alters emotional memories. So in these studies, we're separating the effects of MDMA during encoding and during retrieval. So in separate groups of subjects, we give them MDMA while they study some emotional materials, and then 2 days later they come and remember those materials in a drug-free state. And another group gets placebo on the encoding session and drug on the retrieval session. And they're studying positive and negative emotional stimuli. And these are the results from that study. This is a histogram basically showing you that the dark purple here corresponds to the placebo session. I can't see this well enough to. So the top panel is the negative emotional memories, and the bottom panel is the positive emotional memories. And the MDMA is actually making them less sensitive to both. It's a leftward shift after MDMA, so it's making them less sensitive to negative emotional memories, but surprisingly, it's also making them a little bit less sensitive to the positive. The effect is smaller in the bottom panel, but there's a large shift in the ability to remember the negative stimuli. So this is, again, consistent with the effects of the drug in a clinical situation and to improve memories of bad prior personal events. And this just to show you that with neutral stimuli, there's no change of the MDMA on memories. And just as a very last piece of information, Matt Baggett has done some interesting work on something called authenticity, which refers to the feeling that you're able to be yourself and you can reduce self-censorship. And he's shown that acute doses of MDMA actually improve feelings of authenticity. So just to summarize, I've given you a very rapid overview of all the effects that MDMA has been shown to do in laboratory studies and some of the things that it doesn't do. It doesn't affect sexual responses and it doesn't decrease acute anxiety. There are many questions remaining. We can ask, why are the effects so subtle when we look in the lab? Are the effects specific to MDMA, or would we see them with other stimulants or other psychedelic drugs? What are the mechanisms, and how do people differ in their responses? So I just want to acknowledge all the many people who've worked with me on this, and thank you for your interest.
If you have a question for Harriet, you can come up here and use this microphone.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you for your research, your continued research. I believe it was in the 90s, there was a concern with neurotoxicity of the dopamine. I know you said that there's not reuptake, but I think there was a belief that dopamine reuptake into the serotonin cells would oxidize. And I think they would even recommend taking a low dose of an SSRI to plug those receptors. Has there been further research into that? Has it been debunked, or?
There hasn't been very much support for that idea except at very high doses. So the studies were initially done in rats and at very high doses, and then there was some complication about an error in some of the studies. So we feel confident that at least the doses that we're giving, I think any drug that you give in high or take in high doses over a long period of time is likely to have bad effects. But the immediate concern about neurotoxicity, I think, has been put aside.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I was interested that you studied 0.5 milligrams per kilogram in the socialization,
Yes.
social activity. We've noticed, just kind of anecdotally, in our PTSD studies, when we've used 30 milligrams, for instance, followed by half of that, so a total of 45, it seems to have an anti-therapeutic effect. People are more anxious and had less improvement from the therapy with the lower doses of MDMA than they do with, say, 75. And I wonder if you have more information about
That's
that
very
kind of
interesting.
effect.
That's very interesting. We're very cautious about going up in doses. So this was a first look, and it was in combination with an acute stressor, and known, would increase cardiovascular. We do see some effects at higher doses that you don't see at lower doses. So the release of the increase in plasma levels of oxytocin is much more. I mean, we basically see no increase at the lower dose, and we do see it at higher doses. So it could very well be that there's and I could very well imagine that you'd see some anxiety or some arousal effects at the low dose, and then something else kicks in at the higher doses.
Right,
So
it seems to
yeah.
have a certain amount of stimulation, and people get a little more aroused, but
But
they're
then
more anxious, and it doesn't have that other effect that's
Very
helpful.
interesting, very interesting, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hi. I noticed on the emotional response to emotional stimuli, negative and positive, that the encoding effect was stronger than the retrieval effect on both the positive and the negative. And I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
I don't really have an explanation. That's probably just the way it is. I think the encoding process is much more complicated. They have to perceive the stimulus, they have to process it, they have to consolidate it. So it could be that it's a much more powerful experience than the retrieval part of it. But I don't have another explanation. But they're very different processes. It's hard to, we put them into one study, but they're actually very different questions, whether a drug affects how you put down memories and whether a drug affects how you retrieve a memory.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So since Torsten didn't get a question time, I thought that since all of your talks were related this morning, we could invite up Kim and Torsten to answer any questions if you'd like to come up, and you can just use the podium mic. So, and you guys are welcome to ask anyone for your next questions.
Great talk. My question, psychiatrists in clinical practice very oftentimes use psychostimulants like methylphenidate off-label for, usually for treatment-resistant depression. But so I was glad to see that you use that as a control. But I wonder, do you foresee an issue with catecholaminergic depletion with use of MDMA in treating psychiatric disorders? Because usually we run into that with psychostimulants.
I guess one difference is in the dosing regimen. In the studies that they're doing with PTSD, they give the drug a limited number of times, whereas with children with attention deficit disorder, they get it daily, all day. So there could be more hazards involved with the chronic administration like that. So it's hard to compare them.
Hello, I'm curious about the, you said that MDMA does not increase responsiveness to sexual stimuli, and you mentioned it, I didn't hear you, is it like videos you're showing people, or images, or is it an actual person? Because I feel like,
It was images, it was visual images, and they were either implicitly or explicitly sexual. They were not real people. And if you're going to ask, would the responses be very different if it was real people? I don't think we have the answer to it.
yeah, I mean, just from my own personal experience, I expect it would. Maybe just me, maybe MDMA doesn't make you as susceptible to porn, but somebody, because the porn isn't going to listen to you and respond to your touch differently, and I don't know, just anecdotal, but
Fair enough.
Hi, I have one question for Harriet and one question for either Kim or Harriet. First, Harriet, given that MDMA produces a long-term tolerance in recreational users, I'm wondering if you feel that might have skewed your data. 40 times could actually make a person not able to really experience the full effects of MDMA. Why did you not use MDMA-naive subjects in your studies?
Same as Kim's concern about the ethics of exposing somebody to a drug. It's quite a powerful drug the first time, so we don't really want to be the ones that are responsible for that.
Were you not able to find just people that maybe only did it less than half a dozen times? 40 seems like a lot.
It's a good question. We could go back and look to see whether number of uses influences the responses. We've done one collaborative study with a group in California and a group and the Lecti group to see whether, and the Lecti group gives MDMA to naive people, and the California gives it to people who've used it hundreds and hundreds of times. And we compared the acute responses to the MDMA in those varied, and in our people who are moderate users, and they were identical. They were identical.
If you gave me 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, I wouldn't feel a thing. And then this question for either of you. When animals are given fluoxetine, Prozac, and when humans are on 20 milligrams per day, they don't feel MDMA at all. So it has been suggested that the effects on norepinephrine and dopamine are secondary to the serotonin release, but MDMA itself has no direct action on any of those receptors of those other neurotransmitters. Do you know if that's true? And similarly, my understanding is that other than the SERT, the only receptor of serotonin we know that MDMA binds to is the 2B receptor, and that may play a role in its effect, but at the same time, fluoxetine simply prevents all the effects of MDMA. So what might MDMA do otherwise?
You have a lot of questions, but I think that's pretty clear. There are classic stimulant effects, so dopamine and norepinephrine. So it's partially an amphetamine-like drug. There are some lab studies that have looked at fluoxetine, and it does block the acute effects of MDMA. So that's right. And I can't remember what the other part of the question was.
So the 2B receptor, fluoxetine won't touch.
Yeah, there's differences of opinion about whether it acts on 2A or 2B. So.
From a clinical point of view, so we have treated a lot of people in underground work with fluoxetine on board, but the response is attenuated, but it's still there. You just give a little higher dose. So it's not that it's not there.
Okay.
For sure not.
I see a potential risk story, and so I'd like to ask all of your opinions. Because if you say that MDMA increases trustworthiness, but then decreases response to fearful faces, does that mean that people might be putting themselves in risky situations? And I don't see that as a big problem from what I hear, but I wonder if you think that might be the case, and also if there's a way to actually study that to do a bit more to see if that's true, because then you might want to give certain kind of warnings or messages to people.
It's an interesting question. I think until now, MDMA is used recreationally in a very socially kind of comfortable environment. So it's rare that people take it and then go into a sort of a threatening environment or a place where they could be taken advantage of. Now, in the clinical studies, I'm not sure, maybe you want to speak to that.
Yeah. I would think that if you are in an environment where a lot of people has taken MDMA, so you are not as much in danger because they are also in that kind of state, so they trust you, they don't want to do bad things to you and so on. But it can be misused or abused in a way that some people may give it to persons they want to love them or this kind of stuff. So there is a certain potential for manipulation, I think, but mainly in environments where you not have so much people around, which are in the same state, kind of, I think.
Okay. Kim, what do you think about that?
No, I think so too. Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. But it doesn't necessarily relate to people walking out in front of cars. So it's maybe about less responsive to fearful emotions, but you're not less responsive to risky situations like walking in front of a car.
I think you're right in that respect. There are not so much car accidents, for example, where MDMA is involved, especially not as the only substance, but you can find cases with methamphetamine, for example, where the risky behavior is much more there. And so I think it's less dangerous than methamphetamine, for example.
Me again. Regarding the tolerance, I know you said some of your subjects were 40 or more sessions. Has there been more study on what the source of the tolerance is between either the inability to bind to the receptors, or is it the downregulation of the serotonin receptors themselves? Has that been looked into?
I don't know the answer to that.
So I would say there are two different kinds of tolerance. So one is if you have a serotonin depletion going on 2 times, let's say in 2 successive days, then after, if you take the 3rd dose, so to say on the 3rd day, then your serotonin vesicles will be all depleted, and so you can't get the effect anymore. And so a lot of people will tell you after they do it a lot of times, let's say 15 days a month or something like that, they will tell you, oh, the MDMA in the former times was much better, you know, because they don't realize that their serotonin storage is still out. And so they only got the amphetamine-like effect from MDMA. That can be gathered all the time. And so it means you're left with the amphetamine-like component of the MDMA effect. And if it comes to a tolerance in the long range, I don't think that there is a certain tolerance. But if you take it, let's say, every 3 months for 10 years, you got 40 doses then, or maybe 100. I don't think that there is a tolerance development, but what we have seen in clients is that if they take it more than 10 times in a psychotherapeutic frame, then you see that all the tension systems which you may get rid of during the therapeutic work because of all that relaxation on the muscular level as well as in the soul, then there is no tension to get rid of anymore. And so the effects may get less impressive subjectively.
Okay, thank you so much, you guys.